welcoming Liz Wells.
Thanks very much, Gary. It's about 3 years since Gary told me about the plans to set up the centre here, so I've known something about what you're doing for a little while, so it's exciting to actually arrive here and meet some of you. Okay, I just need to make a system here that's going to work. Recently, oh, and I should apologise, I'm going to read the paper, and it should take about 45-50 minutes, which hopefully means that it will fit within the lunch hour for those of you who have an hour. After that, I'm as flexible as whatever schedule Gary has arranged for me, so hopefully there'll be some time for some discussion and feedback and so on. How are the acoustics of this room? Can you hear me at the back?
You could use a little more volume.
Okay. Yeah, because it feels yeah, but
I'm waiting for students
yeah,
to kind of bring them in.
yeah, but it sort of feels like the ceiling's a little low, and maybe I need to project a bit, so I will. Recently, I reviewed an exhibition of work by artist Alex Hartley, which included his response to participation in the Cape Farewell project. Cape Farewell is an initiative in which artists and writers visit and make work about the Arctic. Hartley made a set of photographs in documentary idiom detailing a group of dwellings built for a party of scientists in 1957 and still standing, preserved by ice and zero humidity. And this is one of the dwellings which he's relocated into a snowy landscape. My initial response was disbelief. Surely this is a digital construct, the village that is. I took it as a figure of the artist's imagination, a metaphor for isolation experienced in remote places. But as far as I can ascertain, this group of cabins does exist, although I wonder how Hartley happened across them. My review was titled Uncertainties of the Topographic in Source magazine, for those of you who are particularly interested in photography, and I still feel I might have been spoofed. Now, I start with this example not because of issues of verification, but to point to critical scepticism. Of course, the idea that photographs straightforwardly trace, stencil, or represent reality, whatever that might mean, has long since been challenged. Awareness of digital processes has further enhanced criticality, and we're even less likely nowadays to believe what we see. It is clear that photographs reflect particular intentions of the photographer as much as that which is shown. And in this respect, perhaps we should view photographers as researchers and storytellers, contributing within many competing histories related to particular places. Part of the pleasure of viewing images is the noting of rhetorical devices and strategies deployed by photographers as visual narrators. So this paper investigates contemporary topographic practices. And I want to argue that credibility rests not on photo technologies, chemical or digital, nor on the expressive abilities of photographers as artists, but on the integrity of photographers as artist researchers, and, what's more, to suggest that this was always the case. As viewers, we are reassured by systematic methods of research through image making, and by careful consideration evident in the presentation of results. And I'm going to pursue this through brief reference to the work of Burnton Hillebesher, and also to the so-called New Topographic Group of post-war United States photographers. Oops. I shall then consider work by contemporary practitioners as listed. Okay, the term landscape is widely used, and in some fields, cultural geography for instance, it has been suggested that it has become too imprecise to be of value. There are variations in its use in the visual arts, but we cannot ignore the influence of landscape painting as a genre, which means that we cannot avoid the term. W.J.T. Mitchell suggests that the term landscape is best used as a verb. And I think this is a useful strategy, as it reminds us that human agency is always involved. Topography might then be viewed as a subset of landscape practices. And what interests me about this definition is the emphasis on surface features collectively, because it implies an overview. As we all know, in the 19th century, photography was greeted as the visual medium most able to represent phenomena in accurate detail. That governments, the military and commercial organisations commissioned photographers to chart the land testifies to belief in the fidelity of the photograph. And photographers, through accepting such commissions, implicitly concurred with and therefore reinforced ontological notions of the accuracy of the image. Photography was both a product of modern scientific and technological development and became a tool in the service of modern aspirations. It played an extensive role within the sciences and social sciences, particularly anthropology, sociology, and geography. These fields all have histories founded in empirical exploration, fieldwork, case studies, and so on, and are concerned with description and analysis. Oops, one too many. There should be. Okay, I've lost a slide somewhere. I'll read it. As Dennis Cosgrove has commented, if geography is a discipline that examines relations between modes of human occupants and the natural and constructed spaces that humans appropriate and construct, then landscape serves to focus attention on the visual and visible aspects of those relations. So photography fitted itself as an instrument of topographic documentation, contributing to travelogues, visual ethnography, and geographic surveys. For instance, the commissioning of photographers such as Carlton Watkins, Muybridge, O'Sullivan to chart the American West and to document sociogeographic change wrought by railroads, mining stations, and other 19th century entrepreneurial developments. And again, as is well known, the Art Museum later took up their work. In the mid-20th century, curators, most notably Zarkowski at the Museum of Modern Art, extolled photographic seeing as a particular mode of artistic vision. Briefly, it was argued that photographic seeing is pure, that's in quotes, or special, because it is unmediated. That the photographer responds directly to that which is observed and has limited latitude for interpretation. So what then happened was that there was emphasis on the unique perception of the artist, the photographer as an artist, which in a way might seem to contradict the notion of unmediated photographic seeing. But the argument was presented in terms of individual aesthetic sensibilities, pre-visualization of the image, and also of technical excellence. And whilst there are many apocryphal stories of photographers carrying axes and saws in order to cut down branches or bushes that might interrupt vistas, unlike painters, in principle they cannot just add a river or tree at whim, or couldn't do so until the advent of the digital, and I'm told by colleagues who are photographers that it's still quite difficult to do this. So the notion of unmediated representation became a part of the ideological currency of the image underpinning its documentary authority. So the hailing of photographers as artists and of photography as a modernist form has of course been challenged on a number of counts, not the least of which is that this claim is premised on a romantic view of the artist as a special sort of seer. It also tells us very little about actual working practices or about meaning production processes. And I'm not going to attempt to summarise the debates here, but I do want to point out that questions of context became particularly salient within those debates, and to remind you of Rosalind Krause's discussion of O'Sullivan's picture, Two for Domes. She contrasts two versions, O'Sullivan's own print, later acclaimed by the Art Museum, and a lithograph made for publication in Clarence King's Systematic Geology in 1878. Krause observes that, for the latter version to function as information, topographic elements had to be restored to the picture. The difference between the two versions is not to do with the brilliance of the photographer and the dullness of lithography. Rather, it stems from the needs and expectations of different cultural domains. Scientific utility versus aesthetic sensibility. And furthermore, she suggests that the image, acclaimed by Zarkovsky as what he would surely have termed a masterpiece of composition, was more likely to have been determined by an intention to sell it for stereoscopes than by an aesthetic economy of the photographer's eye. Again, as I'm sure you know, stereographic views require strong central features to provide focal points and heighten the illusion of the three-dimensional. The context within which O'Sullivan was working was commercial, not artistic. He worked as an operator, selling views to photographic businesses, who became the copyright holders. The work of these early jobbing photographers became declaimed as art, retrospectively, at a point when it suited those within the arts institution to argue a case for photography. And the argument brought into play a claim for photographers as artists that on the whole would not have been how they saw themselves. Luckily, in a way, as a consequence of this, landscape photography secured a place within the art archive. I mean, I welcome that dimension. Historical work is conserved and now exhibited both in the Art Museum and in national or regional historical collections. In the former, it is framed in terms of the perception of the photographer as artist. In the latter, more in terms of social history. Now, so it's against that sort of historical background and a ridiculously brief summary, but just to put a few points in place, that I want to explore the role of the photographer as author or producer today. And in order to do so, I'm going to focus on working methods. This is obviously relevant to a range of photographic practices, but here I'm restricting explorations to topography and contemporary landscape practices. Walter Benjamin remarked that photographs reflect the optical unconscious, including information not knowingly observed. The mapping of land use, including buildings, boundaries, and other social phenomena, is the primary purpose of topography. And of course, photographs, with their ability to note that which we wouldn't necessarily have seen, photographs are particularly suited to recording topographic detail. I guess you're probably all fairly familiar with two key developments in topographic photography in the second half of the 20th century. So I just sort of touch in a couple of reminders. First of all, the return to new objectivity associated with the Beschers and their students in Düsseldorf. And second, the new topographics exhibition at George Eastman House, Rochester, in 1975, which brought together the Beschers and a group of then youngish American photographers, including Louis Baltz, Robert Adams, and Stephen Shaw. Working from the 1950s onwards, the Beschers were interested in typologies, which they described as families of objects or motifs. Oh, that's the missing quote. Okay. Yeah. The way they grouped images simultaneously facilitates comparison between objects of similar type and identification of characteristics typical of a category. And much of their work concerned industrial edifices whose function is to extract from the ground. Their blocks of pictures, each with similar distance, framing and depth of field, command attention both because of equivalence and because of differences in detail. The style is one of detached observation. Authority, I would like to suggest, emanates from precision of content and from the systematic work method. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Benjamin's work, but just to remind you that in discussing the author as producer, he argued that, by contrast with photomontage, new objectivity was ineffective as a mode of political intervention. Noting its basis in reportage, he argued that photographic aesthetics and technique transfigured objects and scenarios, however ugly or sordid, rendering what he termed human misery beautiful. The work of the Beschers and of the new topographers would fall foul of his stricture that a photograph of the outside of a factory tells nothing of the socio-political relations that obtain within it. This does not in itself undermine the authority of the straight photograph, but it does remind us of the critical limitations of topography. The legacy of the American new topographic photographers was not through typologies, so much as through the sheer extensiveness of projects, and again a detached objectivity that intended to be anti-metaphoric. For instance, in Louis Baltz's series, The New Industrial Parks, no people appear, although human presence is implied as functional buildings centrally dominate. Titles are clinical. He cites location and address. And Baltz himself refuted any notion that, as photographer, he had privileged insight into the meaning of a photograph. He suggested, in effect, that photographs show and audiences respond. I actually heard him speak about his work sometime in the mid-80s in Britain at Watershed in Bristol, and the audience got very angry because they asked him what he meant, and he said, "I didn't mean anything. What do you think it's about?" It was a very, very interesting clash of understandings about what photographs do. Baltz also claimed neutrality as an observer, although some, notably Robert Adams, some of the group that is, did not go that far. But with hindsight, the new topographic interest in urban sprawl and environmental degradation as settlement further expanded in the West appears as social critique. But I don't think those photographers saw it as such. I think the reading is emerging now from re-evaluation of the images and what they tell us actually about planning priorities of the time, rather than emerging from any photographic style. So what I'd like to do now is consider some contemporary examples. This is really weird because I've got to do this dance, I'm sorry about this, from the button to the screen, because I can't see on there what's on screen, but never mind. I wanted to start looking at some contemporary examples in order to sort of tease out some of those questions about the source of authority of the image, because these are images that still get tended to be taken as sort of topographic evidence. For instance, 2 English photographers recently made work using maps as the basis for selecting observation points. In Ireland, Kate Mellor used Ordnance Survey Land Ranger maps to plan a trip around Britain, exploring the coast as a boundary and as an area of human activity. Photographs looking out from shore were made every 50 kilometres, using a wide-lux panoramic camera originally designed for survey work. Of course, looking out to sea is a perennial theme for artists, and writers' accounts of coastal travels are legion. But Mellor's approach is distinctive for at least 3 reasons. First of all, the book includes the map, showing the grid used by her. The scheme is made evident. It is, of course, a ruse. There is no conceptual reason for photographing every 50 kilometres. Why not 23 kilometres or 71? Yeah. And besides, cartography is not neutral. It involves the power to define, interpret, and encode information, and as a discipline, implicates issues of land ownership and territoriality. But the adoption of such a scheme provided a working method. Second, the time involved in this project. It took 3.5 years to complete. This indicates commitment and persistence. And third, her photographs always include the shoreline, thereby avoiding the romanticism of looking out to sea, indicating aspects of cultural activity and offering botanical and geological detail. Her interest is in human response to the maritime and in ways in which different regional histories are inscribed at the water's edge. The publication proceeds clockwise round the map, not from where she lives, Yorkshire, but from south of London, that is, from a point near to the English capital, in effect acknowledging its cultural and economic significance. We are taken on a journey through which regional differences in the lie of the land and our use of it are revealed. Of course, aesthetic and technical considerations, as well as image content, must have influenced the precise viewing position from which each image is made. But the authority of the series emanates from the crisp documentary idiom, underpinned by evidence of a systematic approach. Mark Power likewise employs a documentary rhetoric and a systematic approach. For A System of Edges, he took the 2003 edition of London's A to Z street map as a framework for exploring the city boundary and the space beyond. He went to the outer edge of each of the 56 pages and photographed a place just beyond the edge, at this point paying some attention to photographic content and composition. The photographs show buses at the end of the line, new housing estates, and industrial legacies. He looks outwards, his back towards the urban centre, and often there is little sense of this location as a peripheral, which leads us to wonder why it was determined as a boundary. As with Mellor's work, the scheme is made evident through including the map with photo locations in the exhibition. The photographs are exhibited in geographic order. The viewer experiences a virtual orbital walk. This situates the work in terms of location and social content, a social context. And flat print tones enhance a feeling of banality. But pictures operate metaphorically as well as in terms of content and context. Power, talking about his work when it was first shown last October at a There was a day event too on documentary that took place. And Parr remarked that although he had a structure, it was only once photography was completed that he realised that the project was about social identity, about inclusion-exclusion, and the significance of being in or beyond London. He added that he remembered as a child regretting not being able to claim to have been born in London. He is from Harpenden, Hertfordshire, a couple of miles too far north. However methodical, there is always some respect in which our research relates to ourselves. And indeed, the margins often feature in his work. A previous series took his fascination with shipping forecasts as a starting point for pictures made at coastal points from which area weather forecasts take their names. Captions reinforce this, drawing attention to location and time of year, rather than referencing the scenes played out in front of a camera. The Finisterre one always strikes me as particularly sort of opening out a whole set of questions. I'm fascinated by it, you know. And incidentally, when I contacted Mark to ask him to send me images for this, it turned out that he was in North Canada and it was the middle of February and he'd just come in from the icy cold. And he was able to email me a set of images, you know, which is just remarkable. But I did think that was a rather extreme margin to be testing himself at the time. So those are a couple of examples where cartography and the geographic seem to be particularly in play. But I wanted to think now for a bit about re-photography, which is likewise systematic, but in this case drawing on historical photos. A site is revisited after a period of time, in effect recording cultural geographic change. Probably the best known example was Second View, published in 1984. And this, I suspect you all know about Second View, but just to remind you that Mark Klett and associates spent much of the 1970s collecting 19th century photographs of the American West, noting dates, determining time of year, visiting sites, seeking the original composition and re-photographing. The project married interest in social change with investigation of photo histories as they explored issues such as accessibility, movement of light, effects of weather, which influenced and limited the achievements of their predecessors. And also were interested in ways in which light and shade lent drama to the original images. The project is extensive and painstaking. It can be a long wait until shadows replicate the correct time of day. There's a huge amount of material in the book and on their website and so on about this. What the photographs do is demonstrate manifest changes in geography and social use. Some examples are surprising. For instance, where we might have expected increased human habitation, we may find the opposite. And in some cases, despite repeated attempts, they found themselves unable to reproduce the original image due, presumably, to slow geological shifts and to climate change. William Henry Jackson's famous 1873 Crucifix of Snow, also painted by Bierstadt at an earlier stage, simply refused to reappear. And Third View, which is the more recent version, completed in 2000, involved a further set of visits to more than 110 sites using audio tapes and digital video, as well as still photography. And I think the sound and the video offer a further sense, and a different sort of a sense, of how earlier occupants may have experienced places. But one of the things that particularly interests me about the Extension project is that in his introduction, Mark Klett includes a section on fieldwork and methods, in which he outlines procedures and discusses interpretation. Such explicitness is common in the social sciences, but less so in the visual arts. And, again, I'm building here on the idea of a scheme and systematicity, which obviously is fundamental to rephotographic methodologies. And there are several examples. I mean, one of the best known example that's relatively recent in the UK is that the curator at the Museum of London, Mike Seaborn, in 1997, led a project documenting change along the edge of the Thames, which is based on a panorama made for the Port of London Authority in 1937. Or in 2001, Jem Southam rephotographed the Bristol docks, duplicating his own photographs from the mid-80s. Southam normally revisits sites regularly over a period of time up to 5 years, documenting the same place at different times of day and year. And through revisiting, he develops an intimate familiarity with the characteristics of particular locations and seasonal change. Care, detail, and repetition lend authority to the work. So this series of detailed observations of change as the cliffs crumble at Sidmouth on the southeast of Devon coast involved regular visits over a period of 18 months. It's actually just a few miles away from where I live and also where Jem Southam, who is a colleague of mine, lives. The work was first shown in London in Speed, a large group show at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in 1998. And by contrast to many of the exhibits, it reminded us that speed does not necessarily have to be fast. But then, of course, this is a matter of cultural perception. Human sense of time and geological sense of time are rather different. In terms of geological time, the rate at which the rock face is disintegrating, being absorbed by the sea, is probably quite alarming. The scale to which his pictures are printed contributes to our response. For instance, expansive views at river mouths out towards the sea contrast with the smaller scale, which lends a sense of intimacy to a pond in the woods. Botanical and geological detail is revealed as are effects of season, light, and weather. And he's not interested in the sharp light of summer. He doesn't photograph for about 4 months a year, nor is he interested in the poetics of shadow play. His landscape stories are not dramatised. Rather, the grouping of images invites us to examine minute environmental detail. Picture titles usually simply log location and date, sometimes with a brief reference to the geological. And in this respect, the title, the Painter's Pool, this one is actually untypical. The story behind this is that another colleague, a painter, used to paint at the pool, and when he became too ill with cancer to go on visiting, he asked Jem to care for the pool. So Jem took over the mantle of visiting the pool until our former colleague died. And I think Jem's now decided that to sort of leave it to rest. If, as cultural theorists such as Doreen Massey have argued, places are sites of multiple and diverse histories, then Southam, as storyteller, offers one perspective on change in particular places. Ingrid Pollard similarly makes repeated visits to particular regions and sites. Her fieldwork always includes interviewing people and shadowing them at work, as well as researching social history, botanics, and geologies. Her methodical approach to research is typical of topographic modes, but she uses form and context of installation to indicate interpretive latitude. For instance, in 1994, she was resident artist at Lee Valley Park, East London, which is a public space extending 23 miles from Bow in urban East London northwards into Hertfordshire. Soil samples were mounted within the frames alongside photographic panoramas, and as you see here. And I'm sorry about the quality of the slides. They are actually the artist's installation shots, and I wish she had bothered to go along at a time of day when they would have been slightly better. But I have no way of, they're the only examples I've got. But she also made portraits of park rangers, their sites of work and the tools used. And again, in the originals on the wall, she hand tints. She uses hand tinting into black and white imagery, or at least used to. She's now working more digitally, obviously. So these are actually very beautiful objects, as well as being informative, but the PowerPoint just destroys any of the sense of the surface texture, of course. And the exhibition, titled, as I said, Hidden Histories, Heritage Stories, which again is indicative in terms of the idea of a photographer as storyteller, also included installation of found objects and a fictional account of an 18th century black worker based at the mill that was actually in the park, which later became a gin distillery. The juxtaposition of black and white photographs with samples and stories indicates the diversity of sources and findings, and also reflects her view of place as a site of competing stories, experiences, and perspectives. The exhibition was in the foyer of the Park Visitor Centre, and thereby interwoven with current usage, which of course encouraged local audiences to reflect upon their environment. And she used a similar approach. This is sort of slightly older work, but she used a similar approach recently. Interviews, visual observation, geological and botanical exploration, including exposing film through burying it in the ground during a residency at the Farne Islands off the coast of Northumberland. And again, showed the results first locally. Very much sort of tried to bring in local audiences to think about their own environment. So the point here is that whilst her approach as a researcher is methodical, her findings are not presented just as conventional, straight photographs. In this respect, it has an affinity, her work has an affinity with the interdisciplinarity of cultural geography. As a photo researcher, a combination of system, fieldwork, and intuition underpins her approach. Just to refer back to Ingrid Pollard, I was thinking you probably all do know her work in the Lake District. That work seems to be endlessly on tour, and I think is on show somewhere in the States at the moment, which is called Pastoral Interlude, which is about black people in the Wordsworth landscape. It's an old work, but it's the work she endlessly gets remembered for. Danish artist Olafur Eliasson is known for kinetic light sculptures and ambitious light installations. In the UK, he did this big installation called the Weather Project, which was a huge sun in inverted commas, at the Tate Modern in 2004. And in fact, he did kinetic installations at Venice Biennale when the Biennale year must have been 2003, I suppose, representing Denmark. But he also makes photographic series, like Southam, and indeed like the Beschers, using repetition to detail change or difference. Gallery installation blocks together separately framed images. One series shows fronts of buildings in Reykjavik in Iceland and develops from the landscape format images on the left across to portrait format images on the right. Our attention is drawn not only to individual facades depicted, but also to geometric difference, as the frame in the picture echoes the shape of each edifice. And I should say that when you see, I saw this, I went to see a retrospective of his work in Sweden towards the end of last year, and it's a huge physical encounter. You know, this installation takes up that wall. Again, the PowerPoint is not doing it any justice. So the experience of looking at it is that it really dominates us, you know, as audience. And I think that's quite important. The scale matters, the sort of immensity matters in his work. A set of panoramas, also from Iceland, is unusual in integrating black and white and muted colour images. And the subtlety of change here means that minor differences come to seem highly significant. The series have clearly been meticulously researched and planned, not only in terms of sites, season and source materials, but also in terms of the grammar of gallery presentation. So my investigative starting point for this paper was an interest in the relative fluidity of digital technologies and the implications of this for topographic photography. Prints can be adjusted. Materials online can be downloaded and changed. And now digital backs are available for large format and survey cameras, although I'm told they're not cheap. Of course, there are implications for authenticity, and visual trickery is increasingly easy. But in thinking about this, I concluded that the fixity or fluidity of the image is not the main consideration. Rather, the integrity of the topographic stems from consistency and commitment. Systems and schemes of work are perhaps the main legacy of the Beschers, along with their formal precision and their concern to link one image or object to the next. Their best-known students, Ruth, Struff, Gursky and Hofer, all also deploy an aesthetic of detached and detailed observation and make work whose meaning accumulates through groups or series, for example, Struff's museum tableau. But unlike the Beschers, they all operate primarily within the terms of the art market. Picture scale is indicative. However, a number of contemporary German photographers persist in more documentary modes, with book publication as a primary means of dissemination. And for reasons obviously relating to the history and the location of Germany in the reunification of Europe, borders and sites of transition are a common current theme. For example, Doris Fronapfel relentlessly travelled Europe, photographing borders, crossing points between nations that no longer carry the significance previously ascribed to them, and also a significance which is sort of further undermined by global consumerism, which now overlays specificities of language and local culture, and also in a situation where the oppositional ideologies of the Cold War period no longer have purchase. So I think there's sort of a multiple set of shifts and changes that form the context within which she was going to previous points of transition between nations and also going to the outer edges of the new Europe. Her work is a good example of the coming together of typification, topographic method, and the concerns of cultural geography. Her extensive series of colour photographs, muted in tone, captioned as location and date, and also saying something about the activity that's going on there, indicate economic uses of borderland sites, and testify, a bit like Mark Power's work really, to the banality of places which, in terms of national and cultural identity, have been, and in some respects remain, complex points of transition with multi-layered histories. But again, method was a primary consideration. A few more. There are hundreds of these. I'm just showing you the tiniest handful. The photographer stands back. The foreground is generally empty. The focus is on edifices and events in the middle distance, whilst the horizon stands for that which is beyond this transitional space. But what I've also been teasing away at is the idea, the question of then, what is a photographer as an author? And in considering this question of the authority of, well, photographs anyhow, I do think we need to think about this business of authorship. So I went back to looking at some of the classic essays. As you know, Roland Barthes, in The Death of an Author, it sort of made this sort of wonderful rhetorical statement, really. He wasn't actually suggesting that artist photographers don't exist, that they're dead. What he wanted to do was point to the place of writers or photographers within systems of discourse, and to disavow modernist notions of originality, those that people like Zarkovsky stood for, which were premised on linking genesis and genius. And I love this quote because I love the notion of a text as a tissue of quotations, really useful. And he's actually talking about written texts, but I'm interested in the photograph as a text. It reminds us to consider the fluidity of cultural legacies and remnants as they become incorporated and re-inflected in particular conjunctions and contexts. And the idea that things need to be disentangled. He adds the notion, an emphasis on things being disentangled rather than deciphered. Which again, you know, you can decipher a code, but if there is a complex multi-layering with all sorts of things going on there, you have to disentangle. You can't just straightforwardly decipher. And as you'll remember, in a rousing final flourish, he declared that, quote, "the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." But what he didn't do was propose any alternative way of taking into account the fact that someone writes the words or frames the image. So where does that leave us when considering the photographer as producer? Well, I find Foucault more useful because he asks, what is an author? But then he goes on, if you remember, to suggest that what he terms the author function has a role within discursive systems, which is not merely one of cultural cipher, but transcends this, because, as he suggests, thematic and stylistic characteristics unify a body of artistic work. And I think this focus on the function of the author does allow space for the idea of the author as bringing a particular creative perception and a particular consistency of approach. But on the other hand, situates the producer within systems of production, thereby refusing modernist notions of art and the artist as somehow transcending this. So if we follow Foucault's formulation, authority stems in part from consistency of ways of looking and seeing. Photographers consider subject matter, form and style, method, and, as I've indicated often retrospectively, metaphoric implications. Projects are researched, objectives clarified, photo methodologies tested, and images premeditated, taking into account constraints of production and contexts of dissemination. All of this lends authority to the photographer as investigator and storyteller. So, to summarise, as I've argued, the authority of a topographic is primarily founded in methodology, in evidence of a systematic approach to research, and also of the integrity of the artist-photographer as researcher. The photographer's ability to deploy photographic codes, aesthetic conventions, and the semiotics of scale and titling within the context of gallery installation and book or website publication enhances the sense of careful consideration, thereby lending further authority to stories told. Earlier 20th century work was similarly methodical, but limited attention was paid to this. Perhaps the documentary directness then associated with chemical photography seemed sufficient guarantee. But if authority emerges from the research underpinning representation, then the means of image making makes little difference to credibility. What has changed is credulity. Awareness of virtual possibilities has induced a more critical audience. Could that really have happened? Does that really look like that? If so, this testifies to new levels of visual literacy, skepticism, and criticality that are to be welcomed by those of us concerned with the ontology of the photographic, although I'm really not certain where that leaves geographers and others whose practice has tended to take topographic photography at face value. Thank you.